Hello, welcome to another virtual program from Maine Historical Society. I'm Kathleen Newman. It's October 15th, 2025, and this is our program on Madwomen, murderers, and I'm forgetting the third one, but this is about women and crime in the 19th century in Maine. And this is part of our series on Notorious, which is our exhibit on crime in Maine and New England. Now, before we go any further, and before I introduce our speaker, let's just take a moment to remember that we are on Wabanaki homelands and that we recognize the inherent sovereignty of the Abenaki, Maliseet, Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Penobscot nations within these lands and waters. Understanding Wabanaki history is vital to understanding Maine, and we affirm our commitment to partnering with Wabanaki people to share and contextualize this history with our program offerings. Joining us today is Dr. Aimee Keithan, a buildings archaeologist with international experience in the heritage and museum sectors. She holds a PhD in the conservation of historic buildings from the University of York, England. Her research focuses on revealing the lived experiences of marginalized people by examining the spaces they inhabited. So, for example, she's recently been working on research revealing the lived experiences of enslaved peoples at George Washington's Mount Vernon by examining the architecture of the estate. And she's participating in a collaborative research project on country house servants in the UK. She is the educational programs manager of Greater Portland Landmarks, and she joins us this afternoon to talk about crime, specifically crime and punishment with women in Maine in the 19th century. Aimee, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, everybody, for being here today. I'm really excited to share with you some research that's been a real passion project of mine over the last couple of years. Today, we're going to talk about madams, murderesses, and madwomen, female criminals in 19th century Maine. These are women who have largely been lost to history, relegated to a few lines in jail records or sensationalized newspaper accounts. But each one of them has a story, and I'm hoping to give them back some of the voices that they've been denied. I do want to take a moment to thank the people and institutions that made this research possible. First, I want to thank Maine Historical for inviting me to present this work. I'm really honored to be part of the incredible variety and quality of talks and exhibits that they put on as part of the Notorious theme. The entire project began with the Lincoln County Historical Association, who not only gave me access to their records, but actually started me on the journey by asking me to do research that would highlight the old Wiscasset jail, which I highly recommend visiting if you haven't already. I am deeply grateful for their trust and support in telling these stories. I also want to give a special thanks to Corinne Tanzer, who helped me navigate some of the trickier aspects of researching marginalized populations, particularly uncovering Bridget Whalen's story, which you'll hear about later. And I do appreciate Maine Historical's commitment to Native Indigenous people and making sure that we all know that we are on unceded land. I also like to add something that is meaningful and directly tied to the research that I do. All American history, past and present, is inextricably tied to the people and cultures whose land we reside on. So I'd like to dedicate this particular research to Betsy Francis. Betsy is exactly the type of person I'm trying to return agency to through this work. She was a basket maker from Old Town, and newspaper mentions of her perpetual drunkenness hint at sort of this indomitable personality. Although referred to in the racial slurs and colloquialisms of the time, she's also described as omnipresent, not to be shaken, and inimitable. By the time she died in 1916 of liver cancer, likely from a lifelong alcoholism, Nobody even knew how old she was. In one account, she was accused of claiming to own the whole region hereabouts. And I can't help but wonder what she could have been and what cultural knowledge died with her. So this research is for Betsy. Let me tell you a little bit about how this research project came about and what we'll be covering today. A couple of years ago, I started combing through a century's worth of jailors' records from the old Wiscasset jail, which belonged to Lincoln County Historical. At that time, my purpose was actually pretty straightforward. I wanted to examine the spaces in the jail itself. I was interested in the physical history of the building, but as I went through the records, I kept encountering names that pulled me in a different direction. I wanted to see who was actually held there, and I became particularly interested in highlighting minority prisoners, people of color, people with mental health issues, and women. What I found was that the women's stories in these records were often incomplete, sometimes just a charge and a name. But those fragments told me that there was so much more below the surface. Today, we're going to explore three categories, and I've made these categories up to help organize my research. And I've called them Madams, Murderesses, and Madwomen. They are not just labels, they represent the ways that society tried to categorize and control women who stepped outside accepted boundaries. Through their stories, we'll see not just crime, but poverty, mental illness, survival, and resistance. Before we dive into the stories themselves, I want to give you a sense of the scope and nature of my research. The records and women I've looked at range from the early 1800s through the late 1800s. During this period, there was a lot of change, social, economical, political. Maine transformed during this time from a backwater province of Massachusetts to a state with its own distinct flavor. Laws were passed and rescinded, wars were fought, cities were built and burnt. And methods of recording, how we document people's lives and crimes, varied and changed just as much as the laws and punishments and social services did themselves. So my main resources for this research were court and jail records, newspaper articles, vital records, and historic documents, including records from the Maine, the former Maine Insane Asylum, as it was originally called. And many of us know it as the Augusta Mental Health Institute, which is no longer open. Within the jailers' records specifically, women were definitely in the minority. On average, for every 10 entries for a man, there was one woman. But these women were brought up on almost every charge that men were: larceny, drunkenness, selling liquor, running tippling houses, keeping a house of ill fame, murder, assault, arson, and more. Now, I want to be clear what this research is and isn't. It's not intended to be deep biographical information into these women's lives. What I'm doing is piecing together tiny nuggets of information: a jail entry here, newspaper mention there, a birth record, a death certificate, to try to get a more complete picture of who some of these women were and the circumstances that might have contributed to their criminal actions. And although I was able to find out more about some women, many, many more exist only in a single recording of their crime: a name, a charge, and then silence. The intent here is to get you to question not only the labels these women were given in history, madams, murderesses, and madwomen, but also the labels that we give to people today. Crime and imprisonment are still deeply stigmatized, but they're actually far more complex than we often acknowledge. These women's stories remind us of that complexity. So let's begin with our first category, madams. These were women I've decided to put under this category charged with lewdness, selling liquor, running tippling houses, and keeping houses of ill fame. Those were the actual charges of the time. But as we'll see, the reality behind these charges is far more complicated than this label suggests. These crimes weren't random. They were specifically tied to locations that had specific demands. Houses of ill fame, or brothels, clustered in port cities like Rockland and Portland. Between 1858 and 1881, Adelaide Nichols, Lydia Marchant, Nancy Reed, Anne Byrne, and Anne Crawford were all arrested for operating houses of ill fame in Rockland, consistently meeting the same need created by sailors and maritime trade. Tippling houses, which were essentially taverns, and illegal alcohol sales, on the other hand, also frequently appeared in villages and social centers, places where people gathered and wanted to drink, even if it was illegal to sell alcohol. These women weren't criminal masterminds. They were just women meeting demand where it existed, often because they needed the income. Interestingly, women were often arrested in pairs or groups. Sometimes this made obvious sense. In September 1881, a newspaper reported a Portland raid on 7 houses of ill fame, arresting 4 keepers, who were the owners, and 10 girls, which is what they called the workers. Interestingly, the keepers were charged, but the girls were only kept as witnesses, so they weren't actually charged with a crime in this case. But women were even arrested for seemingly individual crimes as well. Hannah and Mary Clark were arrested for lewdness in Wiscasset on March 18, 1842, and they served a month in jail. Rachel and Sylvina Blaisdell were arrested for lewdness in Phippsburg on June 2nd, 1832. The fact that these women shared last names with the other women that they were arrested with suggests that they were likely related, sisters or even mothers and daughters. And for those 2 examples in particular, I was unable to find them in a record with enough detail to put them together and find out what their exact relationships were. Now, one perspective on why women were frequently caught together committing these crimes might be that women influenced each other into a life of crime. After all, lewdness was a vague moralistic charge that could encompass anything from prostitution to simply being seen as sexually improper. It was a way of controlling women's behavior and sexuality. But another perspective, and one that I think is worth considering, is that they stayed together for safety. It's worth noting that the only crime that only men were charged with was rape. Women arrested for lewdness or working in houses of ill fame were vulnerable, and perhaps staying together, working together, was a form of protection in a dangerous world. When we think about houses of ill fame, brothels in the 19th century, there's a common stereotype: the independent madam luring young women to a life of crime, running her business outside the bounds of respectable society. But the records tell a different story. More often than not, houses of ill fame and illegal taverns were actually run by husband and wife pairs. Let me give you some examples. Mary and Seth Hamilton were arrested for selling liquor without paying a special tax in Portland in 1878. This was part of a statewide raid that netted more than 6 other people throughout Maine on the same day for the same charge. Anne and Thomas Boyd were arrested for selling liquor in Boothbay, another coastal town that would later become known for rum running in the 20th century, the early 20th century. The many inlets and islands made it perfect for smuggling. There's even talk of a trapdoor in the floor of the toll house on the footbridge that might have been used to drop and receive illegal liquor from boats passing below. Nancy and Joseph Peters were arrested for selling liquor in Bremen, also in 1878, and served 2 months in jail. Both Nancy and Joseph were people of color. They were both members of the Peters family, who established Peterborough, Maine's first free Black community. And their races confirmed. They're included in Dr. Stakeman's A Black Census of Maine. Lydia and James Ware ran a brothel in Rockland, a busy, bustling port city where the sailors came and went, creating ready demand for such services. The question is, were these truly partnerships or something else entirely? Let me tell you about Mary Waltz. She was arrested in July of 1848 for keeping a house of ill fame in Damariscotta, and she served a customary 1-year sentence. At first glance, there's nothing particularly remarkable about Mary's crime. Another woman making a living the best she knew how, right? But here's what makes Mary's story so important. Her husband, Jacob Waltz, was arrested at the same time for the same charge, and Jacob had a much longer criminal history. He first appears in records in 1825 at the age of 19, and he's arrested for assault. Only a year later, he's arrested again for assault. It was a pattern. This suggests that Mary's life may have been tumultuous and her marriage potentially violent, far from the freedom that some might imagine a businesswoman running a brothel would enjoy. These weren't always independent madams making autonomous choices. Many of these women were caught in circumstances shaped by poverty, violence, and the men in their lives. The husband-wife business model wasn't necessarily a partnership. It may have been coercion. So when we talk about madams, we need to ask, who were these women really? Were they independent businesswomen, or were they trapped by circumstance, poverty, and sometimes violence? The label madam carries a certain connotation, but the reality was far more complex, far more human, and far more tragic than the stereotype suggests. Now, I do want to mention that in this section, if you have a sensitivity to hearing about violence, infanticide, or suicide, some of the stories in this section do include that, so you may want to switch off now. If not, listen up. We're moving on to our second category, murderesses. These were the rarest type of charges in the jail records, murder and attempt to kill. But I was surprised by the number of women that I found. Each time I saw the charge, it stood out. Even today, men are far more likely to commit murder than women. So when I saw these entries, I immediately saw a voice that was waiting to be heard. The crimes we're about to discuss are tied to three major themes. First is the sensationalism of women criminals. The late 19th century saw the rise of yellow journalism, sensationalist newspaper reporting that prioritized dramatic stories over accuracy. We still have a lot of this today. Women accused of violent crimes were rare enough to be fascinating, and newspapers tended to portray them in extremes, either as evil masterminds, manipulating innocent men, or as helpless victims with no agency of their own. Neither portrayal captures their full humanity. A second theme is illegitimate children and abortion. Society made having children out of wedlock so shameful and stigmatized that it often forced women to desperate measures. Without providing any legitimate options for these women, society made illegal actions the most attainable choice, despite the enormous risks and emotional toll. Women facing unwanted pregnancies, were forced to undergo dangerous practices, and their lives were sometimes endangered. And the criminality of the procedures made an already difficult situation even more harrowing. And the third theme in this section is the reality that women weren't necessarily in charge of the outcomes of their pregnancies. The men involved, whether they were husbands or lovers or doctors, often made decisions that determined what happened, while the women bore the consequences and the blame. The first woman I want to introduce is probably the most sensational story in this presentation. Lucy Ann Mink's entry in the jailer's records was immediately intriguing because under her name it said, alias Lucy Ann Mank. It turns out that wasn't her only alias. In 1873, 29-year-old Waldoboro native was arrested for murdering Dr. Peyton Baker, who was her previous employer. Newspaper accounts suggest that they may have been having an affair or been involved in some sort of questionable business dealings together. So Lucy asserted that she shot Dr. Baker in self-defense after he shot her. However, she didn't have any bullet wounds and they never found a gun. Usually, you don't dispose of a weapon if you've just committed a crime in self defense and are waiting for the police. Nonetheless, she was actually acquitted of the murder and was in jail for less than 4 months before she then moved to Massachusetts and completely changed her name to Lulu Martin. What followed, combined with Lucy's earlier charge, begins to build a picture of who she was: passionate, quick to anger, not a woman to be crossed. Lucy began having an affair with Charles Ricker, an engineer at a Lowell textile mill. She did not take it well when Charles tried to end the affair, and once again she found herself accused of shooting a man, and once again she had an improbable story attached to the events. The newspapers covered the story really heavily, calling it the Lowell tragedy, referring to her as the prisoner before the court, even reached a decision as to whether she was guilty. And as you can see here, illustrating Ricker's shooting in dramatic detail. She claimed that she had intended to kill herself and only shot him accidentally. And then to support her story, she'd taken a large amount of laudanum before the police arrived, which they did first interpret as a suicide attempt. But unfortunately for Lucy, Charles lived long enough to recount the events, which made it clear that she shot him in cold blood from only a foot away. This time, she was not quite as fortunate and ended up serving a 9-year sentence, but only for manslaughter. Lucy's story demonstrates yellow journalism in action. The newspapers could not decide whether she was a femme fatale or a desperate woman, but dramatized her story nonetheless. Elizabeth Jack, also known as Elizabeth Jackson, was a 28-year-old married housewife from Appleton, Maine. She was arrested in 1880, also for murder. Elizabeth had fallen in love with an illiterate 54-year-old Mason and Civil War veteran named Alicia Lynn Scott, who was also married. They had been living together for a year at that point, and unsurprisingly, she was pregnant. According to the newspapers, it was alleged that she gave birth to, quote, a male child in the presence of nobody but Lynn Scott, who did not take any means to preserve its life, but on the contrary, carried it into a cold room and left it to perish, after which it was concealed in the cellar, end quote. The child's birth and even death don't seem to be in question. And those two, the parents were both tried together. Unfortunately, the jury wasn't able to agree, which resulted in a mistrial. So no one was held accountable, even though the few details available clearly show that Lynn Scott was the active participant, while Elizabeth Jack was only passively involved. Would the outcome of the trial have been different if Elizabeth and her lover had been tried separately? Perhaps most troubling is what happened after the trial. Records of Lynn Scott show him going on to lead a well-respected life as a family man. There's no mention of this in any records after. Elizabeth, however, virtually disappears from the records. I wasn't able to find anything else about her except a record of her death of a heart attack 21 years later, having lived in the same town that her lover lived in for most of her life. Even though there was a mistrial, one of the pair was clearly punished far more than the others over their lifetime. Alicia was allowed to live a regular life and continue on with his reputation relatively intact. Elizabeth, we just don't know, but she seems to have sort of disappeared from the record. The last woman I want to talk about in this section wasn't arrested for a crime, but she was in a similar situation as Elizabeth Jack and therefore could have been. Her story contains the sensationalism of Lucy Ann Mink's story with the tragedy of Elizabeth Jack's. What followed became a media sensation, with newspapers providing day-by-day trial coverage. In 1879, 18-year-old Annie Small left Machiasport to work as a housemaid in South Portland. Downstairs in the apartment building that she worked in lived 24-year-old Dr. Charles Witham, his wife Esther, and their young daughter Annie Bell. Charles seduced Annie, not his daughter, Annie Small, taking her on excursions where they carried on an affair and also sending her letters when he traveled for work. When their relationship was discovered, Annie was fired and returned to Machiasport pregnant. Her aunt then sent her back to Portland to confront Witham. He promised to take care of everything, placing Annie at Margaret Smith's house on Middle Street in Portland. She was a nurse known for sheltering unmarried pregnant women. But what happened next became the central dispute of the trial. Witham's story: he administered standard medical care for a pregnancy he claimed to have no intimate knowledge of. When he was called to deliver Annie's baby, it was stillborn, so he disposed of the body. Witham's wife, Esther, sat resolutely by him during the trial. Meanwhile, this is just an aside, their 3-year-old daughter lay dying of brain disease. She would be dead within months. So all of this is going on, and in Witham's life, and his very own daughter was actually gravely ill. Now, Annie's story, she said that despite Witham's denial of an intimate relationship, she produced love letters, which the newspaper printed. Before the actual delivery of her child, Witham gave her both pill and liquid medicines. Several doctors then independently testified those were abortificants. And when she did give birth to a live child, the baby was whisked away. And then later, another witness in the house saw a lifeless baby with a gash across its neck. The court asked, was it murder? But consider the human toll. Had Annie not been proactive in bringing these charges, she, like Elizabeth Jack, might have been the one accused of murder. What strikes me the most, though, is the silence around Annie's feelings. The trial transcripts mention only that she trusted Witham and she was shocked by the outcome when he was acquitted. There's no record of her grief, her confusion, her sense of betrayal, even though, according to her testimony, he promised to elope with her. This case illuminates the impossibly complex nature of such crimes. Women had virtually no options. As we've seen with both Elizabeth Jack and Annie Small, they weren't always in control of the outcome, but they bore the legal and moral consequences. So when we label these women murderesses, we flatten their stories into a single moment of violence. But behind each charge was a woman navigating impossible choices in a society that offered them few options and very harsh judgment. These weren't monsters. They were women trapped by circumstance, betrayed by men, and punished by a legal system that rarely held those men accountable. Now we turn to the final category, which is madwomen. This label was perhaps the most slippery and dangerous of all because it raised a fundamental question that haunted the 19th century legal system. When was somebody mad versus when were they bad? And crucially, who got to decide? The language used in these records reveals a willful ignorance about the complexities of mental health. Women were described as lunatics, insane, feeble-minded, or suffering from moral insanity. These are all catch-all terms that could mean anything from genuine psychiatric illness to simply behaving in ways that made the authorities uncomfortable. Before 1840, Maine had no state mental health institution. Women experiencing mental health crises had nowhere to go except for jail or their own families, if their families could manage them or help them. The Maine Insane Asylum in Augusta didn't open until 1840, and even then, far more women ended up cycling through jails than receiving hospital care. Mental illness often led directly to arrest, and jail records are filled with women held for a charge of safekeeping. which was essentially for their own safety, or eventually discharged with orders for removal to the state insane asylum. So these labels, mad versus bad, insane versus criminal, they often fell hardest on the most vulnerable. Immigrants struggling to survive in a hostile new world, impoverished women with no social safety net, and women whose grief and trauma were pathologized rather than treated. Let me start with immigrants. Although Maine was touted as a land of opportunity, it has never been easy for newcomers here. We see that even today. And women faced particular challenges. Irish Catholic immigrants in the early 19th century encountered deep prejudice. Settling into a new place with limited resources and facing cultural hostility, some may have pushed the boundaries of legality simply just to find a place for themselves. On August 6th, 1827, 21-year-old Catherine Womack, who was a native of Ireland, was arrested in Wiscasset for assault. She spent a week in jail. But what's notable is that on the same day, for the same charge, 25-year-old Michael Womack, also a native of Ireland, was arrested as well. Were they related, married? And if so, was this a case of domestic abuse where Catherine fought back? Or were they arrested together for some other altercation? The records don't tell us. I wasn't able to trace them. But what they do reveal is how quickly Irish immigrants could find themselves entangled with the law, how little it took to be seen as violent or criminal when you were already viewed with suspicion because of where you came from. Catherine's story is a single week in jail, a single week in a jail record, but it represents the precarious position of immigrant women who had to navigate not just poverty and displacement, but also the assumption that they were somehow more prone to vice and violence simply because of their origins. If Catherine Womack is a glimpse of immigrant struggle, then Bridget Whalen's story shows us what happened when poverty, child labor, and alcoholism collided, and how newspapers turned human suffering into entertainment. Bridget was also born in Ireland. She was born in 1867. By 1880, at just 13 years old, she was working at a shoe factory in Lewiston. Her 15-year-old sister Mary worked in the cotton mill. They were children working grueling factory jobs just to help their families survive. By 1885, both Bridget and Mary were arrested together for drunkenness. Bridget would be arrested again multiple times in 1890, in 1891, and again in 1892, each time receiving 30 days in the Auburn jail. And each time the newspapers mocked her. In 1887, one article described her as, quote, only a girl, but the crisscrosses and crow's feet and wicked-looking furrows of strong drink make a record of despair on her countenance, end quote. She'd been found in a saloon during a police raid of what the paper called, quote, one of the roughest joints ever run into by the police, end quote. And yet the article focused entirely on ridiculing this 20-year-old woman. By 1892, prisoners in the Auburn jail were making shoes, which is the very work that Bridget had done as a child. The newspaper noted that she, quote unquote, knew the ropes since she'd been there so many times before. Think about the tragedy embedded in that phrase. She knew the ropes. There were no social services for Bridget. There was no treatment for her alcoholism, no acknowledgement that a girl who'd worked in a shoe factory at 13 might need help rather than mockery. She died at 35 years old. Throughout her life, she remained really close to her family, living with her sister Mary until her final illness. But the system had nothing for her except a revolving jail cell door. Our final story brings us to the intersection of all of these themes: grief, gender diagnosis, and the question of when mental illness becomes crime. or when mental illness excuses crime, or simply becomes another way to silence women. In August 1865, Lucinda Lair was arrested for murder. Despite the serious charge, she's nearly absent from the local newspapers. She remained in jail for 2 months until the Supreme Judicial Court ordered her removal to the Maine Insane Hospital in Augusta, which had been open for 25 years at this point. If not for those hospital records, she would be lost to history entirely. But I was able to do some research, and thankfully, the Mental Health Institute records, many of them are online, and they're continuing um, to digitize even more. What I found was that Lucinda was the widow of a Civil War soldier. So in 1865, this loss was still quite recent. Whether to ease her loneliness or for other reasons, we'll never know, she became pregnant with an illegitimate child. 2 days after giving birth, though, she drowned her baby. I wasn't able to find any sources in her own voice or any discussion of the circumstances surrounding the drowning. But what we have instead are clinical hospital records that offer only glimpses of her humanity. At the beginning of her stay, she was restless, many bad nights. She had major stomach issues and bowel issues. Her physical health declined. By March, she even required a catheter. But here's where the gender diagnosis appears. Her doctor noted that she was prone to, quote, fits of hysteria and fits of crying. Hysteria, which was a diagnosis reserved exclusively for women, could mean anything from postpartum depression to grief to simply having emotions that made male doctors uncomfortable. Her entire medical record is clinical. It only has snippets that hint at her actual mental state. In February of 1867, her doctors recorded that she was, quote, now in her best frame of mind, end quote, as though her mind had been a problem to be managed rather than a person in crisis to be helped. She wasn't discharged until October 1867, more than 2 years after drowning her child. Although her voice is absent and her records are scant, her struggle remains loud in what does exist. There's a postscript to Lucinda's story. In the 1900 census, she's found living in Iowa with her sister. The census actually records that she had one child, but she had none living. There's something deeply poignant about that. She had to give that information to the census taker. 35 years later, she still counted that loss. The child she killed, the child whose death destroyed her at the time, was never forgotten. These weren't mad women. They were women in crisis, immigrants facing prejudice and poverty, laborers turned into addicts with nowhere to run, widows drowning in grief with no support systems. Who decided that they were mad rather than bad? Doctors, judges, jailers, newspaper editors, and they all happened to be men. That distinction mattered enormously. It determined whether you faced trial or hospitalization, whether you were seen as evil or ill, or whether your story was told with sympathy or scorn. We still criminalize mental illness. We still criminalize poverty. We still argue about who deserves help versus who deserves punishment. And we still let those in power, often those least affected by these struggles, make those decisions. These women's stories from 19th century Maine remind us that the labels we give people reveal more about our society's failures than about individual moral failings. Madams, murderesses, and madwomen, these were never just criminals. They were women navigating impossible circumstances with almost no support, and they deserve to be remembered as fully human. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That was fantastic. Really interesting stuff. Questions from our audience. Someone's asking, are those the jail in Old Wiscasset, are those records available digitally?
They have not been digitalized yet. I know that their archives committee is working hard to organize and eventually make available some of the resources that they have, but it's a long process. They have a lot of
Sure.
information there.
Can you tell us a little bit about, so this project was sort of sparked by looking specifically at those records, but where else did you go to kind of follow like the breadcrumbs and the trails of these women? Can you tell us a little bit more about like your research process?
Yeah. So ancestry is your friend, family search is your friend. Sometimes, often the jailers' records were such a great place to start because they also included some minimal biographical information. And this was a bit hit or miss, but sometimes they included a physical description. Sometimes they included an age, which you could then get a birth date from. They usually included what town they were from. That information can then be put into a genealogy website, and you can sometimes find them that way. Newspapers.com and some of the bigger cases were helpful, but also finding some repeat offenders because they oftentimes listed, who was in the municipal court for that session or whatever, and you could find them over and over. And then, as I mentioned with Lucinda, the former Augusta Mental Health Institute has at least from 1840 to 1868 patient records, all digitized and online, which is really interesting if you're looking for insight into some of these quote unquote criminals.
It's great. Can you tell me, was there anything that really surprised you or took you by surprise when you were doing this research?
Well, the reason that I left Lucinda's story for last was because it was the one that really set me on this journey. She
Mm,
was the first person I noticed with the as murder as her a crime, and I was I can't even remember how. Oh, because it said that she was sent to the in quote unquote insane asylum, and she was the first person in the jailer's records, the first woman who had been given that as a sentence.
mm,
And and then at the time, they only had sort of half a page digitized of her record, and I saw the word illegitimate, and I couldn't get any more information.
mm,
Um, and I was so intrigued. It seemed crazy, but there was this little story with little tiny pieces. Um, and she was just a name and murder. And then this
mm,
whole story blossomed, and all of a sudden, this woman appeared, and that was the one that really shocked me. And I still haven't found anyone else that sort of resonates as much with me.
mm.
But it's the women that are guilty of infanticide. No one wants to do that.
Right, right.
There's always a story there.
Someone's asking, this is a good question. Did you run into issues with patient confidentiality or other problems accessing records from mental health institutions?
The I did not, only because the patients that I was looking at are freely available online because they have made it past that period of patient confidentiality. That being said, one of the things that I tried very much to keep in mind as I'm telling these stories is that some of these people do have living relatives. Maine is a really small state, and we have really
Mm,
close communities. A lot of the names, a lot of the last names put together with the towns they were from, those families are still there.
mm,
Um, and and this they may have never known about this because it was pushed under the rug. They may have known about it but not wanted it to be part of their story. So it's you have to be really delicate and mindful of the way that you're telling stories.
Sure. Someone else has a research question. Are the jail and legal records available at county courthouses or are they at the state archives?
Sometimes both. So in Lincoln County, the Historical Society has essentially photocopies of the original books. I'm not sure anyone knows actually where the original books are.
Mhm.
But that being said, the county courthouse has some records. The state has trial transcripts. And so I would say the towns would be the first place to look, historical societies, counties would be the next level, and then state would be your last level. Each of them will have different amounts of things just because of, how resources have been shunted to different places over the
Mhm.
years.
Sure, sure. Well, thank you so much. Again, this is really interesting. Thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise and your work with us. And this really was a great companion program to the Notorious exhibit. These stories specifically are not ones that were covered in the exhibit, but a lot of the themes they share with some of the case studies we have in the exhibit are very, very similar. So, folks, I'd encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to come see Notorious yet, please do. It's going to be open through December 31st. And we are open Tuesday through Saturday, 10 to 5. You can buy your tickets on our website, mainehistory.org, but you can also typically get them at the door if you just pop by to see us here in Portland. Aimee, anything else that you'd like to add before we close for the afternoon?
I do just want to thank everybody, but also to let you know if you'd like to contact me, have any questions, or any stories of women in your own family that you want to share, you can go on Greater Portland Landmarks website and find my contact details there. And thank you so much
Fantastic.
for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for being here. Hope we see you again real soon.